Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. I'm excited to have her back on. It's Nomi Prins. She's a journalist, author, and you'll most likely also remember her as she worked at Bear Stearns and also at Goldman Sachs as a managing partner. But she is here to talk about her new book, All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. So thank you for coming back on a Wall Street for Main Street podcast, Nomi Prins.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me back on.
Great. Now, Nomi, what got you interested, what gave you the desire to want to write a book about this time period? I believe your book starts off in the early 1900s?
Yeah, that's right. It starts actually at the turn of the late 1890s and then highlights the beginning period of the 1907 panic and goes towards today's recent crises and so forth. And a lot of my other works over the past 10 years or so have been more focused on bankers than on presidents, and to some extent the political system as it connected into the financial system, but not to the depth that I went in exploring and researching this book. I was very interested in the power relationship over the money relationships to a large extent when I did the archival research for this book, and also the patterns and the families and the blood ties and the protege mentorship associations that connect, that bind, that enforce this sort of mutual power as well as similar ideologies between the men that run Wall Street and have run Wall Street for over the past century, as well as the presidents that have been in power. Because really the presidents and the main bankers are two sides of American power. One is elected and one is sort of evolved. And some of the bankers last through multiple presidential terms. And some of the presidents come in and out of Washington themselves, but in the background have personal, very close associations with bankers. And so it was my desire to explore the very specific nature of their correspondence, the color of their relationships, the character of their relationships, and how that impacted not just economic policy and not just boom and bust cycles and crises or periods of prosperity, but also the impact on wars, the impact on the extension of America as a political superpower and also as a financial superpower at the same time, and really covering the same evolution from the beginning of the 20th century through what we have today. And so that was really the impetus for the in-depth exploration that I engaged in for the book.
Yeah, and you told me off interview that you went to a number of presidential libraries, right? And you spent many weeks there reading declassified government documents, right?
Yeah, exactly. I started with, I did multiple presidents in sort of random time intervals in terms of my travel. I spent a year really back and forth between examining documents at certain presidential libraries and sort of processing that information and putting it into the narrative for the book. For example, I went to FDR's library, to President Eisenhower's library, to Truman, to Nixon, to Carter, to Reagan, to George Bush Sr. Of course, the libraries for George Bush Sr. and Barack Obama don't have any information in them yet. And then there might not be. One thing I realized as I was going through declassified documents is that the closer we get to today's history, really from the Reagan period through Bush Sr., and even through Clinton, there's less and less available information because the rules for declassifying information have become that much more stringent. So though there is information that's continuing to be declassified for some of the past presidents, the more recent presidents going forward will have much less information available because of the rules that have been put in place to sort of suppress a lot of that information. So where I have the most is through the period before Reagan, but then after that I did apply for FOIAs, I did open records that could be opened, and all of this was done to examine predominantly who the big six bankers were during any one period of a presidential administration throughout time, and then again to look at the color and the nature of those relationships. And a lot of interesting things came out. I mean, for example, the Carter Library, where I spent a lot of time, I was able to look at information not just on the financial and economic side, but also on the national security side, and examine many records through that aspect that indicated, for example, the extent of David Rockefeller's connection to the Shah of Iran and how that processed into the hostage crisis, and how the resolution of the hostage crisis would have happened a lot sooner had there been less dirt really coming from the financial community, and the extent to which within Washington, within the Carter White House, there was discussion of David Rockefeller's role with Iran even before those incidents happened, and as well as Chase and other banks, but particularly him and John McCloy, who was one of the other former Chase chairman who also was involved in the Seven Sisters oil companies and so forth. But that was just one period of history. Any of the presidents had so many connections to bankers and personal associations that really any examination I did of documents and of their at times secret correspondence revealed all sorts of information as to how American power really works and how decisions are made, and who really how the influence line connects the White House and Wall Street. And it isn't just bankers pushing the White House all the time. It is really a collaboration. It's an embracing from the White House of what the bankers want to do. For example, during Truman and during Eisenhower, as America was expanding in its superpower nature, there was a lot of trade barriers being broken down, and those were broken down because the bankers wanted them to be broken down, but also because the presidents wanted to expand American presence throughout the world. So again, there was like sort of a mutual association and alignment of goals during those time periods. And today we have less of an alignment of goals because international capital is everywhere. Things go very quickly, and bankers have very close relationships with presidents, but they're not as personal. They're more about what the Washington establishment can do for the Wall Street establishment, as opposed to sort of them both working together to achieve their goals of expansion and sort of power globally.
Now, I would say that's not surprising. You talked about Iran, that the American people is not given the real story about why we're in Iran and the hostage crisis and things like that. And let's go back to World War I, because that's before the Fed. And one of the main reasons that I've read about in history World War I started was Archduke Ferdinand and all these alliances, and he was assassinated, and everyone else dragged everyone else into the war. But wasn't there a lot of loans that were given out by the J.P. Morgan and the other main bankers at the time to the Allies, or was it both sides, and that's why the U.S. was in? And wasn't there also a warning given by the German army in the American newspapers like the New York Times that Americans should not get on the Lusitania ship?
Yeah, there was a lot of behind the scenes, again, collaboration in World War I. Remember, World War I, and this is another larger conversation that's in the book, happened right after the Federal Reserve was established and several years after the panic of 1907, after which J.P. Morgan really pushed to have this idea of a central bank for the United States that could fund banks in panics. But also this was a time where bankers were very much connected with presidencies across party lines. J.P. Morgan had been very connected with Teddy Roosevelt. That was one of the reasons that Roosevelt didn't bust the banks, but he busted other types of trusts. He was connected to Taft. He was connected to Woodrow Wilson before the Federal Reserve was finally signed in December of 1913. By the time you got to the summer of 1914, J.P. Morgan, the patriarch, had died, and his son, Jack Morgan, had arisen within the Morgan Bank, and that was a preeminent bank in the United States, and also from the standpoint of international reach. And that bank has strong ties to the British and the French. On the one side, because historically the Morgan Bank had actually helped with certain situations in the English banking community when there had been crises there. It had been the Morgan Bank that had helped to raise money to sort of fix them. But also they had establishments and relationships and sort of offshoots in France and in Britain, and it was very strongly connected to the Allies. And so there was this very interesting meeting that took place that I talk about in the book, where Jack Morgan goes to Washington and he meets with Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on this platform of being sort of anti-Wall Street power and so forth, but he was friendly to a multi-decade extent with the Morgan family. family and with other major bankers at the time. And so Jack Morgan has this meeting with him in the summer of 1914 as things are getting much murkier and much more dangerous, as you mentioned, along those lines in Europe. And the press is like, why is Jack Morgan meeting with Woodrow Wilson? We thought he wasn't into the whole banking community. What's going on? And the meeting ends, and all these reporters are buzzing around, and Morgan just comes out. He's a very private individual anyway, and he says, ask Wilson. He's not about to entertain questions. So Woodrow Wilson is then asked the question why Morgan is there, and he just says he was there at my pleasure. In other words, I'm not going to tell you. It turns out that during the next month or two, as the war broke out in Europe, that the Treasury Department under Wilson was very much working with the Morgan Bank to increase financing, or the ability to have private financing for the war, and particularly for whatever the Allies, became the Allies of the United States would need. So though Wilson started to platform the idea of neutrality with respect to the war, behind the scenes what was going on was a real push towards supporting the Allies side and supporting it financially, as well as ultimately on a military and political basis. But it was really very much a push by the Morgan Bank and the Morgans and associations of theirs, but also an embracement of that from within Washington. And so ultimately we took the side of the Allies, and neutrality turned into that position. But it was from the beginning a major conversation that had gone on with the Morgan Bank. And the Morgan Bank wound up financing 75%, an extreme amount of the war efforts on a private basis for the U.S. needs in the war, as well as for the Allied needs in the war, a lot of that through loans as well, and also through organizing some of the other major banks, for example, Chase and National City Bank, to be a participant in finances as well. But it was going through the Morgan Bank. By the time we got to World War II, those three banks were really all active players in financing, and there was more broader public financing as well. But in the First World War, it was very much a private endeavor to begin with.
That's very interesting. And also another thing about J.P. Morgan, and you touched on this very briefly, J.P. Morgan convinced Teddy Roosevelt, right, to start the Bull Moose Party, which split the Republicans, and he was also secretly funding Woodrow Wilson, too, behind the scenes, right, because he knew that Woodrow Wilson would be a puppet and would eventually go to war and get them the extra money from the war loans and stuff and the war spending that he wanted. Right, so he controlled, basically the bankers had controlled at least 2 out of 3 or all 3 parties at that time, when the American people thought that at least one of the parties was not controlled by the bankers.
Well, yeah, and to some extent, I mean, it was Taft in the middle, who was a strict Republican between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, but there was a tremendous amount of control and influence. But again, there was an embracing of that control. For example, Woodrow Wilson's relationship with the Morgans went back to J.P. Morgan's father, Junius, who had helped to fund a lot of the development of Princeton University, at which Woodrow Wilson was president before he went on his path to the White House. So there were associations there. There was also associations through National City Bank. The number 2 guy at National City Bank, Frank Vanderlip, who was a big international player as well at the time through multiple decades, was a friend of Woodrow Wilson's. Who would, so they would hang out together. And Woodrow Wilson was quite sickly a lot of the time, and he even writes in one of his letters to Frank that had not been Frank. I'm calling him Frank too, to Vanderlip, that it had not been for his sort of joviality, etc. during his illness, he wouldn't have gone through it. So again, there was bonds on a personal basis as well as on that political, financial influence basis. Same thing with Teddy Roosevelt. That was one of the reasons why in the panic in 1907, a few years before the Fed and World War I, that Roosevelt didn't bust the bank trust of Morgan's. He busted some other things because they had that personal association and relationship, and they mutually reinforced each other's power. The first bailout that happened in U.S. history for the private banking side was under Roosevelt during that panic in 1907, where he commissioned $25 million to come from the Treasury Department basically into J.P. Morgan's pocket in order for J.P. Morgan to decide which banks to fortify and which to let die during the panic of 1907. So again, that association went both ways.
Now, let's transition to the creature from Jekyll Island, a.k.a. the Federal Reserve. How much of the problems today, and since the Federal Reserve has been created, do you think the Federal Reserve has created itself?
Well, the Federal Reserve, we talked about Morgan, was definitely created for the purposes of fortifying the major banks in the country, regardless of the rhetoric that was positioned for the public at the time, and also to give the U.S. One place to sort of print money, have a currency which would allow them politically, they believed, all the different presidents at the time, again through those three parties, believed would help the U.S. grow as a superpower internationally as well. They needed to have a sort of a competitive means of a central bank that could, rise above England and France and Germany and so forth. So by the time The Creature of Jekyll Island, the book talks about what was created at the 1910 meeting that happened in November during Thanksgiving, actually, at Jekyll Island, the men that gathered there, the six men that gathered there, and you have to read my book, the number six really is a strong component of what happens. There always tends to be like six players in the big six banks today. The Crash 29, six guys back then. They were the Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island, who was a very important, powerful, and rich senator, and very connected to the banking community in Washington. His Assistant Treasury Secretary, Andrew Piatt, and four bankers, Frank Vanderlip, who I mentioned before, representing National City Bank, Benjamin Strong, and Henry Davison, and escaping the other big thing. But basically, there are four bankers and two politicians, and that's where a 10-day venture banged out this Federal Reserve project, Federal Reserve plan that became the cornerstone of the Federal Reserve, even though it underwent changes, because this happened under Taft, and Taft couldn't pass it under his administration, but it ultimately passed in a slightly different form, but a similar characteristics under Woodrow Wilson in December 1913. But really, the meeting itself at Jekyll Island was interesting. It might not have even happened had not for the fact that Senator Aldrich was in New York talking about what he needed for the Federal Reserve. He had been traveling for 2 years throughout Europe with a man named James Stillman, who was the head of National City Bank at the time, so with a banker throughout Europe gathering information, sending reports to Washington about central banks in Europe, and he gets hit by a trolley car on Madison Avenue, and so he's convalescing in Madison Avenue, and this report is due to Taft and to Washington, and he's laid up at his son's house. His son, Winthrop Aldrich, turned out to become the chairman of Chase for 2 decades. After that, and the Aldriches marry the Rockefellers, and they spawned people like David Rockefeller, who we were talking about before, as well as Nelson Rockefeller, who was a 4-time New York governor and also vice president. So a lot of things came out of that. But Jekyll Island occurred because J.P. Morgan said, you guys need to get this going, and he provided his membership to these 6 men for them to go somewhere else to Jekyll Island to get this plan sorted and work it out away from the public eye. And also really because he wanted to, the main aspect of power is when you don't have to be at the meeting to get things done. So there was an element of that. J.P. Morgan was a member of the Jekyll Island Club. All the rich at the time used to go there for the December, January sort of holiday break. So this was off season. Thanksgiving was before the season. And no one could go there. No one could touch the island unless they were members. And so he provided a guest membership for all of them. And I was interested. I looked at the records and the books from back then, and their names aren't on there, and his name isn't on there from that period. It's on from an earlier period and an after period. But he really did cultivate the Jekyll Island creature aspect by offering that membership, as well as Nelson Aldrich being hit by that trolley car.
Now, to continue about the Fed, it seems to me the Fed's been around for over 100 years now, that a lot of there's always been crony capitalism. There's always going to be people that don't do the right thing, that don't create value, not good businessmen, that don't look to build a long-term reputation and provide value to their customers and things like that. But do you think the creation of the Fed, America's another central bank, do you think that accelerated crony capitalism here in the United States? Do you think it created moral hazard and led to a lot of the problems with panics?
Yeah, the important thing to note about the Fed is that it was always, first and foremost, a bank for the most elite banks. That was the point. The panics before that happened before the Federal Reserve was established almost accelerated the impetus of the bankers, Morgan and Stillman and Associates, Paul Warburg, sorry, the six men I forgot before. Those men were proponents of having a place where, in panics, if they speculated, if there were bets that went wrong, even though their language to discuss that was different at the time, there would be a cushion. There would be help. And there would also be currency provided, because before that, banks had sort of provided notes to each other. So when there was a crisis of confidence, they couldn't really get paid themselves. Similar, 100 years later, to what happened during the 2008 crisis. There was a crisis of confidence in derivatives. They all had positions with and amongst each other, and that was one of the reasons that liquidity seized up in the system. Back then, it was more on notes. It was more just on lending, and a little simpler aspect of that. But still, the idea of the quality of the lender and the quality of the bank. They wanted a central entity that could sort of cover them. And again, Washington wanted a central entity that could cover Washington, but always to promote the supremacy of these major banks. That's how it was established. That's what's in a lot of its initial language in the conversations behind the scenes and the horse trading that went on in Washington to get it passed, which I talk about in the book. And that's how it's always been positioned. Yes, it moves rates up and moves rates down and so forth, but because it's positioned and continues to be positioned as a backstop for the risk of the major banks, who are its most powerful members, particularly the New York banks through the New York Fed component of the Federal Reserve System, it has created a moral hazard, and it has coddled the biggest banks when they have faltered. And the result is that the largest banks that created it back in the day, and the largest banks that run things today, are largely derivatives of each other. The major six banks have continued to thrive throughout all these panics and all the thousands of banks, for example, that shut in the Great Depression, and so the mini recessions that have occurred, as well as the bigger panics and the international debt crises and so forth that have occurred, have all been propped up by the Federal Reserve, and that has extended into Treasury policy and other aspects of Washington financial policy as well. But that's why today, when there's this sort of media embracing of this notion that the Federal Reserve is there to help create jobs, or sort of help, with its dual mandate of the second mandate being to help with unemployment and so forth, and the other being inflation, is that's not why it was created. That isn't what it does. And the proof is in how it's behaved over the century. And the proof is also, even now, if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, it has $2.5 trillion worth excess reserves, mostly coming from the biggest banks, which is cash that's getting not circulated throughout the economy. So even the notion of the Fed maintaining liquidity is a fallacy. The Fed maintains liquidity first and foremost for the major banks, and those are the same banks that have the relationships with Washington, and those are the same banks that Washington uses for multiple purposes, politically and militarily, domestically and throughout the world. So there's a reason why the Fed was created in that manner, and it has done that role, and it continues to do that role of fortifying the largest banks at the expense of policies that could help fortify the broader population and stabilize the broader economy.
Yeah, and the Fed's definitely a cartel, and some of the other problems the Fed has created, like you said, it's created enormous moral hazard for the bankers here, who only care about their bonuses in the short term, beating earnings any way possible. They make very risky derivatives bets. They may get a bonus on it this quarter, next quarter. You look at what the guys did at AIG, and they were all caring about their bonuses a year from now, but their derivatives exposure and JP Morgan's derivatives exposure is just enormous. Do you think these banks are really too big to fail? Because if we were in a free market, right, and we didn't have the Federal Reserve, would these banks have even gotten as big as they've gotten in the first place? I very seriously doubt it.
Well, no, the Federal Reserve was fashioned as the arbiter of which banks could merge with each other over the years. So these big six banks today, and some of them have changed. I mean, Wells Fargo and Bank of America weren't part of the big six banks in the 20s, but they certainly were rising. They were rising politically as well. Wells Fargo's been around since the mid-1850s and so forth. So those banks were always around and always had those relationships and always had some connection into Washington. What the Fed did was it it solidified that relationship from the standpoint of a friend that also had the power to approve mergers, to advocate for reducing regulations that kept certain financial services divided or kept state lines that used to exist that don't exist now because of legislation that's been passed. But a lot of times before legislation was passed, the Fed would allow the largest banks to kind of sidestep or loophole for existing legislation in order to become more concentrated in capital, to become bigger and to spread out from the standpoint of multiple financial services, which is where we are today and which is where bankers have gotten to. So the Federal Reserve has been a major pillar of support throughout all of that, particularly from the 80s on, where the acceleration of deregulation as well as risk-producing products, the acceleration of technology that allows that risk to be diffused so much more quickly, and the sheer size of the concentration of these largest banks has gotten to epic proportions, and that's been a lot of times the decision of whoever was chairman of the Fed, from Alan Greenspan to Bernanke and so forth, but also the legislation that would then pony up on the back of what was going on at the Federal Reserve. There are also Treasury secretaries under either party. For example, Nicholas Brady under the Bush administration, as well as Robert Rubin, who was a former co-CEO of Goldman Sachs under the Clinton administration, who worked to lobby for deregulation within Congress and at the White House and through the Treasury Department, as well as collaborated with whoever was running the Federal Reserve at the time. So to some extent, there was mutual collaboration there as well. All of which has served to create this moral hazard and the risk. I mean, it's the moral hazard because big banks know that their bets will be supported and they will be made whole, whether it is through their bad bets that caused the Latin American debt crisis as they did in the 80s, the Mexican peso crisis in the 1990s, the subprime crisis more recently. All of those have been subsidized through multiple facets of Washington, including the Fed and Treasury Department and policy and Washington's policy. So that has been, and that concentration of power and influence has really gotten to epic proportions. The one thing I'll notice, there have been times in our past history where the men running these institutions like Chase and Morgan and National City, which became Citigroup and so forth, have had a broader point of view towards also allowing themselves and pushing for their own expansion and their own wealth and their own influence, but also being able to understand that a broader stability throughout the main economy, through the main population, would be beneficial to America as a whole and to themselves. They could kind of see both sides. Particularly from the 30s through the 60s, the bankers that ran these institutions then. And in the middle of the 70s towards now, we have institutions that have really separated from any sort of notion of also maintaining policies that help stabilize the broader economy and help on the financial side with the broader population. Today, they don't care, as you said. It's all about profit. It's all about bonuses. It's all about short-term gain. It's all about short-term positioning. It's all about getting bigger and bigger from the standpoint of concentration and influence. But there have been times where there has been more regulation, there has been more of an impetus of those leaders and of Washington presidents to hold them accountable. So it has been a mutual decision to pursue policies that were more stabilizing than what we've had more recently.
Now, let's transition to the present and maybe a little bit, maybe make some educated guesses about the future. Are you surprised that the Fed and the U.S. government, the U.S. Treasury, and Japan, and basically almost all the developed world is doing pretty much the same thing? Are you surprised that these governments and central banks have been able to keep the game going since 2008 as long as they have?
It is astonishing. I'm not surprised that they have tried. I am kind of in awe of how much political power, how long these zero interest rate policies have gone on, how long the bond buying programs have gone on, and just how much subsidization has been given to the banking system, because it really is at historically epic proportions. For example, the Federal Reserve has never maintained a zero interest rate policy for this long, not through World War I, not through World War II. It just hasn't happened. So that shows. I
call this the Keynesian endgame.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's and it actually, if you look through this supposed recovery and the levels of stock markets, which of course are high because that's where all this extra cash is going because there's nowhere else for it to go. It's not rocket science.
Real estate market too.
Real
Leaving
estate
China.
Well, it's China. And emerging markets and everything.
Yeah.
All of that is because you have a policy of now going on 6 years of really no cost money going through the largest banks subsidized by all of the governments and of all of the central banks, and it's global. So of course there are rampant speculations that are pushing up markets that are the only games in town right now in terms of getting any sort of return. And yes, as you said, the real estate market right now, all the bottom fishers, the private equity funds, the hedge funds that are getting financed by these same big six banks and their global counterparts are bottom fishing and reconstructing securities out of the waste. Out of the foreclosed properties, whether that's commercial or individual or what have you, that have been the result of the practices that led to the 2008 sort of point of crisis. I think we're still in a crisis. The fact that there's been so much subsidization of this flawed system shows us how flawed it is. The fact that it has been so long, the fact that it's been so deep, the fact that there's trillions of dollars on the Federal Reserve book, the loans that come out through the ECB, all of these programs that America and American banks have exported to the rest of the world have gone on for so long. It's actually quite scary. So I keep on getting asked, when is it going to break? And I keep wondering why it hasn't, and then realizing that, I go back and I read my book or think about my research and think, well, these relationships, this idea of fortifying the flawed largest financial players by policies that central banks and governments are choosing to pursue is something that has been accumulating and accelerating for decades. And so the fact that it's occurring is not surprising. That the level of support is, I don't know if it's surprising, but it's tremendous. And it is scary because I don't think it can go on forever. But it has gone on for an epically long time.
Yeah, it's gone on longer than I thought possible, but I didn't think that we would see Belgium randomly appear, as a humongous buyer of U.S. Treasuries. I guess that's the ECB drawing currency swap lines. I didn't think we would see the Federal Reserve, print, 16 trillion after the one-time audit that Ron Paul got after the 2008 crisis. I didn't think that the banks would be allowed to change their accounting rules and mark to model whatever they want, FASB. I didn't think we would see any of these things.
Or that these big banks would have been allowed to stay bigger, where this whole idea, yes, the derivatives market is at epic levels. These banks are more concentrated, so therefore not only do they have more derivatives exposure within their institutional boundaries, that just means there's no codependencies and exposure across boundaries, which means that there's more concentrated risk than there was before the 2008 subprime crisis. It's an astonishing lack of understanding the implications of these policies and also not caring from the standpoint of global governments, banks, and regulators, because, of course, the private bankers are quite fine with this. I mean, they've been expanding and they get subsidized when things fail, and that's not a manifestation of a free market in any shape or form. I mean, I don't think that when I imagine the characters, even of the men that ran banks through the middle of the last century, I think they would be embarrassed by the level of support. I don't think they could have imagined how much big banks would be subsidized by governments and central banks. I mean, I think they wanted support. They would have welcomed support. But I honestly think they would have had more humility about it. I mean, there's whole quotes I have with some of those lead bankers as things were going wrong here and there in the 50s and 60s, recognized that they pushed Washington to help them, but they also had limits. And today there just really are no limits. And a lot of it started with the Latin American crisis in the 80s and policies that have just accelerated since then with respect to the collaboration of bankers and the U.S. government in particular. But it's really at staggering levels.
Yeah, I mean, banking used to, maybe after Glass-Steagall, but a lot of banks before Glass-Steagall was even implemented, it used to be a very boring business. They called it, the 3-5-3 business. You borrow at 3%, you lend out at 5%, you're at the golf course at 3 p.m., and they were lending to, entrepreneurs, small businesses. That was really the key to America's growth.
Yes.
And we're not seeing that where Main Street has gotten any of this capital from any of the TARP or QE programs or anything like that. Really, none of this has trickled down to Main Street because most people on Main Street don't have the money to own a nice stock portfolio or go out and buy, 10 houses at 0% interest.
Well, exactly. In order to have the cash to even put their foot into the door to receive extra loans. So what's happening now is, as I mentioned before, the $2.5 trillion is just excess reserves that banks aren't even required to keep at the Fed. They're keeping with the Fed, and that's just one example of not using $2.5 trillion that is available to loan to any of the small businesses or those particular entrepreneurs, or even to help restructure the debt or the mortgages of individuals so that they would benefit from this cheap money and the subsidies that the banks have benefited from. There's been absolutely no trickle down, in that manner of these policies. There's only been discussion, really for the media and for legacy purposes from the Fed, from the Obama administration in power right now, that has somehow tried to indicate that these policies have been good. The market's up, the economy's not great, but it's coming back. We've been, quote, over this recession since 2009, and all of that's really mythological, and it's actually far worse for the broader economy than it was beforehand because of this skewed support for the risk makers of the world relative to, individuals or small businesses or so forth who would have the capacity to grow.
Yeah, and it's creating worse stagflation. I don't know if you agree with this, Nomi, but in my opinion, it's creating worse stagflation in the real economy. People on Main Street, my food bill since 2006 is more than double. All my regular bills just to survive are up. Rents exploded. If you look at even the government statistics, they couldn't hide the amount of increases in rents. And basically all the everyday costs people need to survive are going up, and the government inflation statistics don't count this. But yet, Wall Street is making money hand over fist off asset prices. Hedge fund managers are making humongous gains off borrowing at zero or doing the yen carry trade because Japan is giving them cheap money. And it's just amazing that everything, it's almost like back to the status quo, basically. It's almost as if 2008 didn't happen. You hardly even hear mentions of this on the mainstream media anymore.
No, you don't. It's almost not even like it didn't happen. It's like, yes, it's like it didn't happen. It's also that there's no indication that it's getting worse on the mainstream media, which is because the mainstream media appears to be believing these aggregate statistics that don't really delve into any of the normal, financial elements of life that you just talked about. Those issues, education costs, healthcare costs. I mean, whose insurance, hasn't doubled in the last few years in terms of premiums, or even gotten new insurance and realized it doesn't cover anything. I mean, all of those real elements of financial life for, the vast majority of Americans and people throughout the world have gotten worse, while this 0% money has been diffused in ever risky practices and maneuvers and structures and so forth globally from the main banks. It's really, and no one is home in the government, in any government, to A, call attention to this as being a problem, or B, have the leadership ability or skills or foresight to do anything about it.
I think that people in the governments, Nomi, unfortunately, are making so much money off the system through campaign donations and, getting put on board of directors, like how Biden's son got all those hedge fund deals, and he got put on the board of directors in Ukraine for the gas company. They're getting just these sweetheart deals from crony capitalism and special interest groups that there's really no incentive for them to stand up like Ron Paul or some of these other politicians and want to do the right thing. They don't care if they get reelected for next term, and they get voted out of office, they're going to stay there and try to do the right thing. I just don't think that the right incentives are in place, unfortunately.
No, I think that's right. And again, what is saddest about that, or one of the elements of sadness about it, is that the idea of crony capitalism, the idea of these relationships, these associations between, particularly the banking community, because it is money that drives the economy as opposed to, production. All of these relationships have existed in some manner for quite a long time. It's just that there have been times where there's been a give and take towards the broader population, towards Main Street, that doesn't exist today. So the positive I took, and I didn't know this, I thought when I set out to write the book and I talked about the relationships before, I also assumed that bankers were, always evil and always only self-interested in everything. But the reality is I let the data talk for itself, and I let journalism work itself as I went through documents. And there were times where there was a solid collaboration. I mean, there were times in the mid-'60s where the partners at Morgan, one George Perkins in particular, had a very strong relationship with President Eisenhower. I know we're going back many years. But he did, and he enforced this notion that Eisenhower should look at tax policies even that benefited the broader population at the expense of corporations, because he, who was a millionaire and a senior partner for decades at Morgan, believed that if Americans had more money in their pockets, everybody would do better. And that whole idea that came from bankers. Winthrop Aldrich, who I mentioned before, he was the head of Chase. He helped to promote the Glass-Steagall Act to separate speculative activities from deposit takers, because he believed that would create more confidence in the banking system and therefore in the economy and therefore in America, which would ultimately help him as well as the citizens. And he worked with FDR on this matter. Those kinds of foresights don't exist. I don't know if they had different incentives back then. They were different men. It was a different time. But they were able to look at the broader picture as well as their own profit and power motives. And presidents were able to ask them, and they were able to provide some sort of a collaboration that was uniquely positive for America. And those incentives have completely disappeared from view today.
Now, Nomi, there's one banker actually who is a great banker, and he was recently the CEO of BB&T. His name's John Allison. If you've heard of him, he works at the Cato Institute too, and he wrote the book recently called The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure. And he tried to refuse to take TARP money because BB&T was well capitalized, but he was threatened by the regulators and the U.S. Treasury Department and the Fed and all these other guys that, we're taking a hardline stance and everyone has to do what everyone else, or otherwise the banks that did take TARP money would be shorted when the ones that didn't would be, not shorted and attacked.
Yeah.
So you should take a look at that book. I don't know if you've read it, but I read that book and it's really good. And it was very enlightening for me from a perspective of a CEO who's more free market, more libertarian, who wants Main Street to succeed.
Yeah, no, I will, and I haven't. And again, that the idea that banks had to be pushed because certain banks needed or didn't need money. For example, Jamie Dimon continuing to say that J.P. Morgan Chase didn't really need TARP money. All of that, is still is part of this fallacy that the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department is there to help Main Street, and therefore these banks need to be fortified, which will help them fortify the country, which isn't what they did, or what the biggest banks did. They really, they kind of fortified themselves, and the country is sort of left on the outside of that policy.
Yeah, I agree with that. The banks basically just did everything from the policies that were designed really since 2008 have just been to preserve the status quo. So DC and Wall Street and special interest groups and large corporations that were borrowing, cheap so they can do leverage buyouts and things like this, so they could just maintain their profits and things like that. And
enhance them, not even, absolutely maintain and also the result has been an enhancement.
Exactly, and most entrepreneurs, unless you're Silicon Valley, but regular entrepreneurs who don't have access to that type of capital, you have technology with some crowdfunding and things like this, but the small businessman is just their access to capital. They have sky high interest rate. We have a lot of small businessmen who contact us, and they tell us, they're getting killed with Obamacare, and they cannot, they have to fire people or not hire new people that they want to grow, and that their access to capital, they're paying sky-high interest rates if they want to borrow, as compared to the larger company in the past normally the spread wouldn't have been as large. Well, in wrapping up this interview, Nomi, I have one final question, and I don't know if it's contained in your book or not, but what types of solutions would you offer then to people on Main Street, no matter what you see going forward?
Yeah, I don't really go through the solutions. I did a whole chapter of them in all of my other books, and they don't seem to be working. I mean, well, they would work if they were adopted, but no, I think that for the small business and for the individual, I think one thing, it's very important to be educated as to what's really going on here. I mean, I know people know they're being screwed and they see the high interest rates and all of that, but then they also look at the media and things that come out indicating, you know, don't miss the top of the stock market, get back in, it's time, don't be left behind, and all of those kinds of messages that have been in the past. Only right now it's just a more dangerous time. And I think if people do have, excess capital, the idea of trying to be a hero in these markets relative to these immense players that have so much more in terms of information and free capital to burn and everything else. And it's important to recognize that that's not a possibility, and to really limit exposure to these big companies. I know you're saying that the smaller types of engines for potentially lending could exist for small businesses and so forth. And I think it's kind of important to find alternatives off the grid of the big banks. Whether those are partnerships between small businesses, whether that's in terms of a partnership of small businesses in a particular industry or element of an industry getting together to find financing outside, through maybe private matters, through outside of the larger financial institutions, and just trying to really work beyond the system. And for individuals, it's hard because we're tied up in the system that we have no control over the policies that run it and the individuals that are most powerful within it. So I think finding ways to stay out of it is really, it's hard. Being educated as to how rigged the game is important, because then at least you're playing intelligent defense rather than, kind of optimistic, maybe misplaced offense. But I don't know. It's beyond that. Because there's so much stacked against it. So I really think that
the rules keep changing.
The rules keep changing, and the way to be
it's very frustrating. Yeah.
It's frustrating, and we have to be knowledgeable, and we have to find alternatives to financing projects and businesses that are outside of the major institutions. And I think the more just supply and demand. I think the more small businesses do that and try to do that, the more there will be places to find capital that are outside of the bigger players. And I think that will be a healthier way to go forward, because we've seen that they're not providing, the zero interest cash that they're getting to help grow from the foundational aspects of America, to help citizens restructure their debt. So we have to really, to the extent possible, go to outside places or create them.
Now, we didn't get a chance to speak about gold and how that's manipulated, but I mean, basically almost every market at this point is manipulated. Like the real estate market, the government wants it, the U.S. government wanted manipulated up, and bond market, the government wanted manipulated up and interest rates down so the government could continue to borrow and do spending programs and things like that. Stock market manipulated up. Seems to me government wanted gold and silver basically capped. After 2011, it got too far way ahead of itself, and a lot of rules were put in place and other things to make sure it stayed down. But please tell our listeners where they can get your book and where they can find your writing on your website.
Sure. I mean, the book's available at on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Indie Books, all those .coms, as well as local bookstores and libraries. My website, www.nomiprins.com, so NOMIPRINS.com. And to your last point, I do talk about that evolution of how banks wanted gold out of the gold standard out of commission, and they were the ones that have pushed that politically and made it happen so that they wouldn't have restraints on capital. And we're living in the results of those pushes. And that also goes to the point of not trying to be the hero. You can pick levels up, tops and bottoms for commodities and for the stock market, but it's important to always be aware that there are bigger players manipulating these markets, and that therefore fundamental logic isn't always going to win, and that's why there needs to be care in these forms of investment.
It's a great point, Nomi. And if I could promote your book a little bit, I'm on Amazon right now on the page, and it's got great ratings. It's got all 4 and 5 stars. So for our listeners out there who want to take the risk and buy the book, I think it's well worth it. It doesn't have even any bad ratings, which is very impressive.
Well, thank you very much.
So thank you again for your time, Nomi, and hopefully we'll have you back on soon, and we can talk more about gold manipulation and other things in interviews, because I have other questions we didn't get to.
Yeah, that's great, and thank you so much for the questions we did get to. It's really good to be on.